The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero for the 8th consecutive night, and through the log framework of his snow tunnel entrance, Josiah Blackwell could hear Russell Holt's desperate axe strikes echoing across the frozen valley as his neighbor tried to chop ventilation holes through his cabin wall. Inside Josiah's cabin, the air remained breathable and the fire burned clean, while snow piled 3 feet deep around the tunnel entrance that everyone had called his greatest waste of time. Before we dive into how Josiah survived what killed 3 trappers that winter, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of wilderness survival will challenge everything you thought you knew about staying alive in extreme cold. The winter of 1842 began normally in the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory. Josiah Blackwell and his partner Miles Cunningham had established their trapping camp in late September, building a standard cabin near a creek that fed into the Popo Agie River. They had trapped together for 3 seasons and had developed efficient routines that made them moderately successful in the competitive fur trade. Their cabin was well built by frontier standards, completed in 5 days with notched log corners, moss chinking, a sturdy door, and a functional stone fireplace. The structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet inside, with a single window covered by oiled deerskin. November brought the first serious snowfall, and December arrived with temperatures that settled consistently below zero. This was normal. Mountain winters were brutal, but experienced trappers knew how to manage cold through careful rationing and efficient trapline patterns. Josiah and Miles had stockpiled 8 cords of split wood, enough to last until March. They had dried meat, beans, flour, coffee, and salt. They were as prepared as any trappers in the territory. On December 18th, Miles went to check their southern trap line, a routine trip that should have taken half a day. The traps were set along a creek 3 miles from camp. Miles left after breakfast carrying his rifle, possibles bag, and a canvas sack for pelts. When he didn't return by dark, Josiah waited, assuming Miles had holed up somewhere safe. Mountain men didn't travel at night in winter. Darkness was dangerous. Miles would wait until dawn. The next morning, Josiah followed Miles's snowshoe trail south along the creek. The tracks were clear, showing Miles had moved at normal pace, checking each trap location. 2 miles from camp, Josiah found where Miles had broken through ice while checking a trap near a beaver dam. The ice had looked solid but concealed a weak spot where current kept water from freezing completely. Miles had gone through to his waist, soaking his wool pants and boots in water only degrees above freezing. Josiah found him a 1/4 mile further along the Gibbs Trail. Miles had tried to make it back to camp, but wet clothing in sub-zero temperatures was a death sentence. He had stopped to build a fire, and Josiah could see where he had tried repeatedly, clearing snow, gathering dry kindling from beneath evergreen branches, arranging wood carefully. But his hands had been too cold, too numb to execute movements requiring fine motor control. The matches were scattered in the snow around his body, 7 of them, unused because Miles couldn't grip them anymore. His fingers had been too stiff to strike them. Josiah stood over his partner's body and understood that Miles had possessed every tool necessary to save himself. He had matches, dry kindling, adequate wood, and the knowledge to build a life-saving fire. But extreme cold had destroyed his ability to execute the solution. The gap between having knowledge and being able to apply it had killed an experienced trapper who had survived 3 winters in the mountains. Josiah buried Miles on a hillside overlooking the creek valley where they had trapped together. He marked the grave with stones and returned to the cabin alone, knowing that what had killed his partner was a problem that went far deeper than one accident on thin ice. Josiah spent the next 3 days alone in the cabin, processing what had happened. He completed the work that needed doing, checking nearby trap lines, splitting firewood, maintaining the fire, but his mind kept returning to the matches scattered in the snow. Miles had known exactly what to do. He had the tools to save himself. But extreme cold had made execution impossible. This was not ignorance or bad luck. This was a fundamental problem with how mountain men approached winter survival. The immediate cause of Miles's death was clear: hypothermia from wet clothing in sub-zero temperatures. But Josiah began thinking about the broader pattern. Every winter, trappers died in the mountains. Some froze like miles, others suffocated in their cabins. Some simply disappeared, their bodies found months later when snow melted. The trapping community accepted these deaths as inevitable costs of the trade. Josiah had accepted them too, until now. But watching his partner die with salvation literally in his hands made the problem concrete and personal. Josiah examined the core issue that killed trappers during extreme cold periods. A cabin needed to be warm enough to sustain life, but warmth required fire, and fire required ventilation. Standard cabin design created a brutal choice. If you sealed the cabin completely to retain maximum heat, smoke and carbon monoxide built up inside. Trappers who tried this approach often woke with splitting headaches and nausea. Some didn't wake at all. Carbon monoxide was invisible, odorless, and deadly. A man could go to sleep thinking he was warm and safe and simply never wake up. But if you provided ventilation by leaving gaps around the door or cracking open a window, cold air poured directly into the cabin. The temperature dropped rapidly. The fire had to burn hotter and consume more wood to compensate. Drafts created cold spots near the floor and around sleeping areas. A trapper might keep the cabin technically habitable, but burn through his entire wood supply weeks before spring arrived. Running out of firewood in February in the Rocky Mountains was a death sentence as certain as carbon monoxide poisoning. Most trappers tried to find a middle ground, partially sealing their cabins and accepting some smoke buildup in exchange for retaining some heat. They lived with constant low-grade headaches, burning eyes, and respiratory irritation throughout the winter. They told themselves this was normal, that everyone dealt with it, that there was no better solution. Josiah had believed this too. But now he started questioning whether the problem was truly unsolvable or whether trappers simply accepted inadequate solutions because they had always done things a certain way. He thought about Miles's matches in the snow. His partner had died not from lack of knowledge, but from physical incapacity caused by extreme conditions. The standard approach to mountain survival assumed men could always execute necessary actions. But that assumption was false. Extreme cold destroyed fine motor control. It slowed thinking. It made simple tasks impossible. Any survival system that depended on perfect execution under extreme conditions was fundamentally flawed. Josiah needed to find a solution that worked even when conditions made standard methods fail. Josiah continued trapping through late December and into January, but his attention had shifted. He still checked his trap lines and processed pelts, but he spent increasing amounts of time observing how animals survived extreme cold. He had always noticed wildlife in a practical sense, tracking game, avoiding predators, understanding seasonal patterns. Now he watched with different purpose, looking for solutions to problems he had never articulated before. He noticed that wolves denning for winter always chose locations with descending entrances. The den entrance would be higher than the main chamber, creating a downward passage. He had seen this pattern repeatedly but never considered why. Now he understood. Cold air was heavier than warm air. In a den with a descending entrance, cold air flowed down and out, while warmer air rose and remained in the sleeping chamber. The wolves didn't need to seal their dens completely. Air circulated naturally, removing stale air and carbon dioxide while retaining heat generated by their bodies. Bear hibernation caves showed similar patterns. Bears chose caves with narrow entrances that opened into larger chambers. The entrance was rarely at the lowest point. Josiah examined an abandoned bear den on a hillside and saw how the design created natural thermal stratification. Cold air settled at the entrance. Warm air accumulated in the upper portions of the chamber where the bear slept. The animal could breathe fresh air throughout winter without losing the warmth it needed to survive months of hibernation. He observed how snow accumulated around these animal shelters. Instead of blocking entrances completely, snow created insulating layers around the openings while leaving air passages. The snow acted as a buffer between extreme exterior cold and the relatively warmer interior. Animals didn't fight against snow. They used it as insulation, letting it build naturally into protective barriers that actually improved their shelter's thermal efficiency. Josiah started thinking about cabin design in new terms. Standard cabins were built like boxes, with entrances at the same level as the living space. When you opened the door, cold air rushed directly into the warm interior. There was no buffer, no thermal transition zone. The door was either closed, trapping smoke and carbon dioxide inside, or open, allowing cold air to pour in. This binary choice created the deadly dilemma that killed trappers every winter. What if a cabin entrance worked more like a wolf den? What if cold air had somewhere to go that wasn't inside the living space? What if the door opened into a descending passage rather than directly to the exterior? Cold air would sink into that passage and flow out while warm air stayed in the cabin. Snow could accumulate around the passage, providing insulation rather than being something to constantly shovel away. Josiah began sketching designs in charcoal on flat pieces of bark. He wasn't an educated man and had no formal training in engineering, but he understood practical physics from lived experience. Heat rises, cold sinks, snow insulates, air needs to circulate. These principles were simple. The challenge was combining them into a structure that could be built with available materials using tools a single trapper possessed. Early November of 1843 arrived with clear skies and temperatures hovering just below freezing, ideal conditions for construction work. Josiah had spent the previous spring and summer trapping, selling his furs, and thinking constantly about the design he had sketched during the winter after Miles died. He had returned to the same location, rebuilt his cabin using improved techniques, and now prepared to add the feature that would either validate his theory or prove him a fool. He began construction on the tunnel entrance on November 4th. The design was straightforward in concept, but demanding in execution. He would extend a log-framed passageway 8 feet out from his cabin door, sloping downward so the exterior entrance was 18 inches lower than the threshold. The passage would be framed with logs spaced 3 inches apart, allowing air circulation while providing structural support for snow that would accumulate around and over the framework. Josiah started by digging the sloped trench, removing soil to create the descending path. The ground was not yet frozen, making excavation possible with shovel and mattock. He worked carefully to maintain consistent grade, checking the slope repeatedly. 18 inches of drop over 8 feet created a grade gentle enough to walk comfortably, but steep enough to ensure cold air would drain away from the cabin. On November 8th, Russell Holt arrived at Josiah's camp. Holt was a trapper who worked territory 5 miles west, a competent man who had survived 4 winters in the mountains. He had come to borrow coffee and found Josiah laying logs for the tunnel framework. Holt stood watching for several minutes before speaking. "What are you building, Blackwell?" Josiah explained, without stopping work. "An entrance tunnel that lets cold air drain away while keeping warm air in the cabin." Holt stared at the structure, then laughed. "You're building a root cellar attached to your door?" Josiah kept working. "Not a root cellar, an airlock." Holt shook his head. "You're wasting prime trapping time on this. Snow. We'll collapse it in the first big storm." Josiah didn't argue. He simply continued fitting logs into the framework, spacing them precisely, ensuring structural integrity. Holt took the coffee he had come for and left, still shaking his head. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more trappers visited and saw the tunnel construction. Each reacted similarly. Confusion, then amusement, then direct statements that Josiah was wasting effort on something useless. The consensus was clear. Blackwell had spent too much time alone after his partner died. He was building elaborate nonsense when he should be trapping beaver. By November 22nd, the tunnel framework was complete. 8 feet of carefully spaced logs, creating a descending passage from his cabin door to an exterior opening 18 inches below threshold level. The structure looked crude, almost comical, like a collapsed woodpile leaning against his cabin. Josiah didn't care what it looked like. He cared whether it would work when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days. The tunnel system Josiah built operated on principles that seemed simple once explained, but that few trappers understood intuitively. The core concept was thermal stratification combined with controlled ventilation. Cold air was denser than warm air, approximately 8% heavier at typical winter temperature differentials. This density difference created natural convection currents that could be harnessed through proper structural design. The 8-foot tunnel extended from Josiah's cabin door at a downward angle, with the exterior entrance 18 inches below the interior threshold. This created a cold sink, a zone where heavy cold air would naturally accumulate and drain away from the living space. When Josiah opened his cabin door, cold air didn't rush directly into the warm interior. Instead, it flowed down into the tunnel passage and settled at the lowest point, the exterior entrance, where it dispersed into the open air. Meanwhile, warm air inside the cabin rose naturally toward the ceiling. Because the door opened into an elevated position relative to the tunnel exit, warm air remained trapped in the upper portions of the cabin rather than flowing out. The system created a thermal lock, with cold air confined to the lower tunnel and warm air retained in the upper cabin space. This allowed continuous air circulation without catastrophic heat loss. The log framework itself was carefully engineered. Josiah had spaced the logs 3 inches apart, a measurement he had determined through experimentation with different gap widths. 3 inches allowed adequate airflow for the system to function while providing enough structural strength to support significant snow load. The logs were 8 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, and selected for straightness. He had fitted them into a framework using notches cut at precise angles to maintain consistent spacing and prevent shifting. As snow accumulated around the tunnel, it created additional insulation without blocking airflow. Snow was an excellent insulator, with thermal properties far superior to wood or stone. A foot of snow provided insulation equivalent to 6 inches of wood. The 3-inch gaps between logs allowed air to pass through, even when snow piled 2 or 3 feet deep around the structure. The snow essentially created a larger insulated chamber around the log framework, improving the system's efficiency rather than compromising it. Josiah had also modified his cabin's chimney to work with the tunnel ventilation system. He built a smoke shelf into the chimney structure, a horizontal ledge positioned partway up the flue. This shelf prevented downdrafts from pushing smoke back into the cabin while also reflecting heat back into the room. The chimney drew air from the upper portions of the cabin, pulling stale air and combustion byproducts out, while the tunnel entrance allowed fresh air to enter from below. The two systems worked together, creating continuous circulation that removed carbon dioxide and smoke while maintaining stable interior temperature. The entire design required no complex tools, no expensive materials, and no specialized knowledge beyond basic carpentry and an understanding of how air moved in response to temperature differences. Josiah had built it alone in 3 weeks using logs, a shovel, a saw, and an axe. The innovation was not in the materials or tools, but in understanding natural principles and applying them systematically. Word of Josiah's tunnel spread through the scattered trapping community during late November and early December. The Wind River Range held perhaps 30 active trappers that season, working territories that sometimes overlapped, occasionally cooperating, often competing. News traveled slowly but inevitably. Men encountered each other at creek crossings, shared camps during storms, met at the small trading post that Franklin Moore operated, 40 miles north. The story of Blackwell's tunnel became a source of entertainment during long winter evenings. Russell Holt proved to be the innovation's most vocal critic. He visited other trappers and described what he had seen, always with amusement. Blackwell built himself an entrance tunnel that slopes into the ground like he's digging for potatoes. Spent 3 weeks on it when he should have been running his trap lines, claims it's going to keep his cabin warm. The other trappers laughed. Some asked questions, trying to understand the logic. Holt would shrug. Something about cold air draining away. Makes no sense. Snow's going to cave it in first heavy storm, and then he'll have wasted all that time for nothing. In mid-December, 2 trappers named Vincent Shaw and Leonard Walsh made a special trip to see the tunnel for themselves. They arrived at Josiah's camp and stood examining the structure, which by then had accumulated its first significant snow covering. The tunnel framework was barely visible under 18 inches of snow, with only the log ends and the dark opening of the entrance showing through the white. Shaw circled the structure twice, then looked at Josiah. "This is what Holt was talking about? You built a tunnel to nowhere?" Josiah was splitting firewood and didn't stop working. "It's a tunnel to my cabin door." "That's not nowhere." Walsh laughed. "Looks like a collapsed woodpile. What's it supposed to do? Keep bears out?" Josiah set down his axe and explained the concept patiently, describing thermal stratification, cold air density, and how the system allowed ventilation without heat loss. Shaw and Walsh listened, exchanged glances, and Shaw spoke. "That might work if you were living underground like a badger, but you've got a cabin. Just keep your door closed and your fire burning." Josiah picked up his axe again. "We'll see what works when it gets cold enough." The two trappers left, and within a week, the story had reached Franklin Moore at the trading post. Moore was a practical businessman who had operated his post for 6 years. He had seen trappers try various innovations, most of which failed. When he heard about Blackwell's tunnel, he filed it away as another eccentric project that would prove worthless. The general consensus among the trapping community was clear. Josiah Blackwell had spent too much time alone after losing his partner. Grief had affected his judgment. He had wasted valuable trapping time building something that looked ridiculous and probably wouldn't work. By the time serious cold arrived, everyone expected the tunnel to be buried, collapsed, or abandoned, as Josiah admitted his mistake and returned to conventional methods. Late January of 1843 brought weather that veteran trappers would remember for the rest of their lives. The cold front arrived on January 23rd, with no warning beyond a sudden shift in wind direction and a peculiar clarity to the air that experienced mountain men recognized as dangerous. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. This was cold but manageable. Trappers banked their fires, sealed gaps around doors, and prepared for an uncomfortable night. The second day brought temperatures to 25 below. This was more serious. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing the air hurt. Men stayed inside except for essential tasks, venturing out only to gather firewood or check nearby traps. The third night dropped to 30 below, and the temperature didn't recover during daylight hours. The sun rose on January 26th to air that remained at 28 below. This was when trappers began to worry. Cold, this severe, typically lasted a day, perhaps two. When it persisted for 3 full days, it became a crisis. By the fourth night, temperatures reached 35 below zero. Wood supplies that should have lasted weeks were being consumed in days as trappers burned everything they had to maintain. Survivable interior temperatures. Standard cabin construction was never designed for cold this extreme. Chinking cracked and fell out. Leather hinges became brittle. Doors that normally fit snugly now had visible gaps as wood contracted. Every imperfection in construction became a pathway for cold air to enter. The wind made conditions worse. Cold air settled into valleys and remained there, creating pockets of extreme temperature that persisted even during daylight hours. Some locations in the Wind River Range experienced temperatures that dropped below 40 below zero. At these temperatures, the normal rules of survival no longer applied. Fire became difficult to start because frozen wood resisted combustion. Metal tools became dangerous to touch with bare hands. Breathing deeply caused lung pain. Exposed flesh froze in less than a minute. Trappers faced impossible choices. Burning wood fast enough to maintain livable temperatures meant exhausting fuel supplies with weeks of winter remaining. But allowing cabin temperatures to drop meant risking death during sleep. Some trappers tried to find middle ground, letting fires burn low at night and stoking them high during the day. This approach resulted in cabin temperatures that fluctuated wildly, dropping to just above freezing at night and rising to barely comfortable during afternoon hours. The ventilation problem became critical. Sealed cabins accumulated smoke and carbon dioxide rapidly when fires burned hot. But opening windows or doors even briefly caused interior temperatures to plummet. Trappers developed splitting headaches from carbon monoxide exposure. Some became confused and disoriented. Others suffered from oxygen deprivation that impaired judgment and created deadly mistakes. On the morning of January 30th, the 7th day of the cold snap, Russell Holt stood in his cabin and realized he was in serious trouble. His wood supply was half gone. His cabin temperature had dropped to just above freezing, despite burning wood constantly. His head pounded from smoke exposure, and he couldn't think clearly enough to solve problems that should have been simple. The cold had become something that could no longer be endured. It had become something that would kill him if it continued much longer. Russell Holt's cabin had become uninhabitable by the 8th night of deep freeze. The structure that had seemed adequate during previous winters now failed in multiple ways simultaneously. The moss chinking between logs had dried and cracked, creating gaps that allowed cold air to pour in. The door, which had fit snugly in autumn, had contracted enough to leave a quarter-inch gap along one edge. The single window's deerskin covering had frozen solid and provided almost no insulation. Interior temperature hovered around 15 degrees despite a fire that consumed wood at an unsustainable rate. Holt tried sleeping in shifts, setting a mental alarm to wake every 2 hours to stoke the fire. But extreme cold affected sleep quality and cognitive function. He would wake disoriented, uncertain how long he had slept, whether he had already added wood or only dreamed of doing so. On the 8th night, he woke to find his fire reduced to coals and the cabin temperature dropped below zero. His water bucket had frozen solid. Frost covered the interior walls. He built the fire back up, but the episode terrified him. If he had slept another hour, he might not have woken at all. 5 miles south, Wesley Thorne faced different but equally deadly problems. Thorne was 24 years old, in his second winter of trapping, and had built his cabin using minimal materials to save time. On the 9th night of the freeze, his inadequate door failed. The leather hinges had become so brittle from cold that they snapped when he tried to open the door to retrieve firewood. The door fell inward, and before Thorne could wrestle it back into position, cold air had flooded the cabin. His interior temperature, which had been holding at 20 degrees, dropped to 5 below in less than 10 minutes. Thorne managed to prop the door back in place using rope and a cross brace, but the damage was done. His fire couldn't recover the lost heat. He spent the rest of the night huddled directly beside the fireplace, so close that his coat began to scorch. By morning, 2 fingers on his left hand had turned white and lost sensation. Frostbite had set in while he slept, despite being inside his own cabin beside a fire. The worst news reached other trappers in early February. A man named Douglas Perry, who had trapped alone 12 miles east, was found dead in his sealed cabin. Perry had apparently chosen to completely seal every opening to retain maximum heat. His chinking was intact, his door was barred from inside, and his window was covered with canvas and pelts. The fire had burned out, but the real cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. Perry had suffocated in his sleep, killed by the same fire that was supposed to keep him alive. Josiah learned of Perry's death when Gideon Talbot stopped at his camp on February 3rd. Talbot was an older trapper, perhaps 50 years old, who had survived more winters in the mountains than anyone else in the region. He had come to see Josiah's tunnel because he had heard the younger man was somehow managing the extreme cold better than anyone else. Russell Holt arrived at Josiah's tunnel entrance on the evening of February 4th, the 10th night of temperatures below zero. He had left his own cabin in desperation, unable to endure another night of impossible choices between freezing and suffocating. The walk of 5 miles in 30 below temperatures was itself dangerous, but Holt had reached the point where staying in his own shelter seemed more likely to kill him than traveling through the wilderness. Josiah heard footsteps crunching through snow in the tunnel passage and opened his cabin door to find Holt standing there, ice crusted on his beard, his face showing the gray pallor of severe cold exposure. Holt spoke through chattering teeth. "I need help, Blackwell. I can't make it through another night." Josiah pulled him inside without questions. The interior of the cabin was noticeably warm, perhaps 45 degrees, warmer than Holt had been in his own cabin for a week. The air was clear, no smoke visible, no burning sensation in his throat. A moderate fire burned in the fireplace, not the roaring blaze Holt had been maintaining to achieve half this temperature. Holt stood near the fire, gradually warming, and looked around the cabin with confusion. "How is it this warm in here?" Your fire's smaller than mine, but your cabin's 20 degrees warmer." Josiah was preparing coffee and answered without stopping his work. "The tunnel. Cold air drains out, warm air stays in. I can keep the door cracked for ventilation without losing heat." Holt stared at him. "That actually works?" Josiah poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "You're standing in it. Does it feel like it works?" Holt spent that night in Josiah's cabin, sleeping on the floor near the fireplace. He woke several times, instinctively worried about the fire burning out, but each time found the cabin temperature stable and the air breathable. In the morning, he examined the tunnel system carefully, walking through the passage, studying how snow had accumulated around the log framework, observing how cold air pooled at the exterior entrance while warm air remained in the cabin. The physics were obvious once demonstrated. Cold air sank into the tunnel and flowed out. Warm air rose and stayed inside. The system created continuous ventilation without the catastrophic heat loss of opening a door or window directly to exterior cold. The temperature finally began rising on February 6th. By February 8th, the extreme cold had broken, with daytime temperatures climbing above zero for the first time in 2 weeks. Trappers emerged from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors. The informal network of mountain men began piecing together what had happened. 3 men were confirmed dead. Wesley Thorne had lost 2 fingers to frostbite. At least 5 trappers had suffered serious smoke inhalation injuries from sealed cabins. Wood supplies across the region were critically depleted. Russell Holt told everyone he encountered about Josiah's tunnel. The mockery that had characterized earlier discussions was gone, replaced by serious questions about construction details. How deep should the tunnel descend? What spacing between logs? How does snow accumulation affect function? Holt, who had ridiculed the project 3 months earlier, now described it as the difference between life and death. Spring of 1843 arrived late in the Wind River Range, with snow persisting through April and trappers emerging from a winter that had tested everyone who survived it. The final count was grim. 4 men dead, including Douglas Perry from carbon monoxide poisoning, 2 others found frozen in their cabins, and 1 who had disappeared entirely, his body discovered months later by travelers passing through the area. Wesley Thorne had lost 3 fingers to frostbite and would never trap again. Dozens of others had suffered injuries, illness, or equipment losses that ended their mountain careers. But among the survivors, a fundamental shift had occurred. The 10 nights below zero had proved that standard cabin construction was inadequate for extreme conditions. Josiah's tunnel system had demonstrated that better solutions existed. By late April, when trappers began preparing for the next winter season, conversations centered not on whether to build tunnel entrances, but on how to build them correctly. Russell Holt constructed the most elaborate version. He spent 6 weeks that summer building a tunnel system that extended 10 feet from his cabin door with carefully fitted logs and a stone-lined floor. He added refinements that Josiah hadn't attempted, including a curved passage that blocked wind more effectively and a covered exterior entrance that prevented snow from drifting directly into the tunnel opening. Holt became an advocate for the technique, teaching it to younger trappers and insisting that anyone serious about mountain survival needed to understand the principles. Gideon Talbot took a different approach. He built a simpler version using the minimum necessary elements: a 6-foot descending passage with logs spaced 4 inches apart. His tunnel was less refined than Josiah's original, but incorporated the core principles and functioned effectively. Talbot was respected in the trapping community, and his adoption of the technique carried weight. If Gideon Talbot built a tunnel entrance, it was worth considering. Franklin Moore began recommending tunnel construction to trappers who came through his trading post. He had seen too many men fail to return in spring, and anything that improved survival rates was good for his business. Moore kept sketches of different tunnel designs and would discuss construction details with anyone interested. The technique spread beyond the Wind River Range, carried by trappers who moved to new territories and built cabins incorporating the innovation they had learned. Josiah trapped for 6 more years in the Wind River Range. He refined his tunnel design slightly each season, but never made dramatic changes. The original concept worked. In 1849, he sold his trapping equipment and moved to Oregon Territory, where he started a small ranch. He married in 1851, raised 4 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1873 at age 62. But his innovation persisted. Into the 1850s and 60s, trappers, hunters, prospectors, and settlers continued building tunnel entrances on mountain cabins. The specific details varied, but the principles remained consistent. Modern historians estimate the technique saved at least 20 lives over the following 2 decades. The exact number is unknowable because survival often goes unrecorded, but accounts from the period reference tunnel entrances as standard features of well-built wilderness shelters. Abandoned cabins across the Rocky Mountains still show evidence of the design, log frameworks extending from doorways, descending passages that allowed men to survive winters that would otherwise have killed them. The innovation required no advanced technology, no expensive materials, just understanding of basic physics and willingness to build something that looked strange until crisis proved its worth.